Hello, my name is Justin Sandifer, and I'm a senior fellow here virtually at the Center for Global Development. Really excited to have all of you with us online today. Kicking off our CGD research seminar series, which has been slightly postponed due to obvious pandemic considerations, but we're restarting here virtually. And we have an exciting event to kick off the series this fall with Gaurav Khanna from UCSD, and more importantly, I think, really, a former postdoc here at the Center for Global Development. Gaurav does tons of interesting work on everything from affirmative action to international migration and education. You know, one of my favorite papers of his on education in India. But today we are talking about the link between trade liberalization and Chinese students in the United States. We have, as a discussant, you know, Gaurav's first pick was Bilge Ayrton, who is an assistant professor at Northeastern University, and who is also works on trade and international economics, is an editor of Feminist Economics, and her particular, I think, narrow and precise expertise on this paper is a paper published last year, Exporting Out of Agriculture and the Impact of WTO Accession on Structural Transformation in China. So knows all about the drivers of Chinese export performance, which is central to the question that Gaurav's going to be talking about here today. Really appreciate both of you joining us. To all of the rest of you joining in the audience, a couple of requests. First, the usual, which is to mute yourselves when you're not talking, so we don't have too much background noise. Otherwise, the powers that be will be muting you from on high. And the second is questions. So we're going to try kind of a two-track system here. And the one track is, by default, if you have questions during the presentation, we invite you to put them in the chat window. And Gaurav's co-author, Ariel, is actually online as well, and he may be able to respond to some of your questions in real time. But if you have something that you feel is so urgent and compelling that you want to interject, Gaurav has bravely offered himself up, and we're going to allow that on an experimental basis and see how it goes. So if you have pressing questions, do interject. But hopefully, if we have to, we'll cut that off. By default, if you can use the chat window, let's do that. All right, we're going to try to keep this whole process to an hour. If there's extra questions and some people want to stick around, we're going to try to keep Gaurav and Bilge on a little bit, but we'll try to keep the main event up to an hour. I want to see, I think we've got some of our co-organizers here. I just want to recognize, I know Michael Clemens is on board, who's maintained this series for years and years. Dave and Vij and others are here, who you'll probably see hosting these in coming months. So once again, welcome to the Center for Global Development. And without further ado, over to Gaurav to talk about trade liberalization and Chinese students in US higher education.
Thanks so much for having me here virtually. I wish, like I was telling Justin, I wish I was there in person, but as soon as this is over, I'm getting on a flight to DC so that we can all hang out. So this is joint work with Kevin and Ariel and Mingji and Miao Jie. So Ariel is here with us today in the virtual audience sphere, so he can answer your questions on chat. But so what is this paper about? Well, when I was trying to think of what this paper is about, Justin always does a much better job of summarizing what my research is about than I ever could. So I'm just going to use his words, which is, the paper is about how the China shock saved American universities, essentially. So thanks, Justin. But so when China joined the WTO in 2001, there was this massive increase in exports from China to the US, but also to other countries, right? It kind of really takes off after 2001. A few years after that, what you really see is that there was this big increase in international student flows from China to the US, right? So where we come in, we look at these two pictures and we ask ourselves, well, are they related, right? So did this kind of export growth in China, did it drive a lot of the student migration from China to the US, right? So why do we care about something like this? Well, foreign students are really an important source of revenue for US universities. I mean, they're important for many reasons, but revenue is one of the really important reasons, especially at a time when state governments have been drastically cutting funds for US higher education, right? You see appropriations from state governments have been falling over the last few decades. And what we've shown in some other work is that this kind of the revenue that over the last 10, 15 years, the revenue from international students has really allowed universities to keep tuitions low and so keep the doors open for local students, and also not have to cut expenditures, right? So schools that could attract a lot of international students, they could maintain their quality. So foreign students are really important for the US higher education sector. But also like the kind of the questions, the broader questions we are trying to really get at in this paper is, well, the first question really is related to this age-old question as migration economists we've been obsessed with, well, at least Michael has been healthily obsessed with for a while, which is how does local development affect out-migration, right? And theoretically, you could think that development might have some sort of ambiguous effects on out-migration, especially when you look at something like student migration, right? Because on the one hand, you could think that if your own local economy starts thriving, then as students, you might think, oh, the local labor market is doing well, the local education market is doing well, I may as well stay at home. But on the other hand, you can now have the income, you can afford to migrate abroad. You can afford to actually pay that tuition and go to US universities. So there might be more out migration instead, right? So it's hard to really know, there's this kind of theoretical ambiguity. The ambiguity also arises if you follow like some classical trade theory. They talk about how there's this debate about whether trade is really a substitute for migration or a complement. And so there are other reasons why this ambiguity might exist, but where we're coming in is saying, okay, empirically, can we resolve this? What is the effect of student migration? And more importantly, like what is the channel that kind of drives any sort of relationship between trade growth and student migration? So what are the channels? Is it just income growth? Is it better information about universities abroad or changes in the returns to degrees from abroad? So what are the channels that we're going to try and unpack, right? The second kind of question that we really are trying to talk to is related to the China shock, right? So there's this huge literature over the last decade really about how the China shock has had really these negative, these adverse consequences for US manufacturing, right? So it's led to increases in unemployment in the manufacturing sector in the US, lowered wages, has affected mortality in the US. But that entire discussion, not just in the research sphere, but also politically and also in the media, that entire discussion has really focused on the US's goods deficit with China, right? The deficit in commodity trade. There's almost no discussion really on the kind of the export surplus in services that the US has, right? And one of the reasons that discussion might be missing is there's very poor data on the services trade. But what we're interested in is this: how is this goods deficit with China really kind of cycling back as an export surplus in services, right? And what we're doing is we're proposing this kind of a new channel. We think that it's that I don't think people have really talked too much about is this increase in the export surplus in services is driven by this increase in demand for services from China, particularly higher education services, of which the US is a major exporter, right? So the US is one of the largest exporter. It is by far the largest exporter of higher education services. And so we want to know how this goods deficit really cycles back as a services surplus, right? So once we identify this elasticity between the goods deficit and the service surplus, we can then do these counterfactuals where we can really unpack what the consequences of these current trade wars are. The current trade wars over the last couple of years, what are the consequences for the export of higher education services and therefore the higher education sector more broadly, right? So those are the kind of the questions we're interested in more broadly. And so what are we going to do here? We're essentially trying to look at the effects of export growth at the city level. So the C subscript is a city in China. Export growth at the city level, how does that affect student flows from that city to the US, right? So what is the relationship between export growth and student flows to the US? For identification, we're going to leverage a trade shock that we're going to really create again at the city level, the Chinese city level. This identification strategy that we're going to use is not new, really. It's extensively been used on the US side to look at the effect of the China shock on the US manufacturing sector. Pearson Schott are the first, I think, to use it. But the idea there is that, you know, there's essentially two types of variation that comes from this trade shock. So one is that, you know, when China, one is a temporal variation. When China joins the WTO, it led to a reduction in tariffs, led to a reduction in the uncertainty around tariffs that allowed Chinese industries to invest a lot in certain industries that they would then export in. But then there's also the spatial variation where different cities were producing different products, and then a tariff reduction in certain products led those cities to grow much faster. So I'll talk about this more in detail when we get to it. But a lot of the literature has used this empirical strategy to study what happens in the US. Except, you know, Bill Gates has this great paper that Justin that referred to is that I encourage everyone to read, but how you could use the same identification strategy to study what happens in China, right? And so, Urton and Leitch essentially show how export growth in China led to this structural transformation really in these cities where people, you know, shifted out of agriculture and there was this huge increase in income. So it's like a really important paper that I encourage everyone to read. But we're essentially going to borrow this identification strategy for our purposes here, right? And so what do we find? What we find is that this export growth was associated with this this big increase in flow of students. So there was more out-migration of students from these Chinese cities to US universities, right? The biggest impacts were on the students that were not funded by scholarships. So we have data on funding as well. So we know that these students were self-funded. And these students, and the biggest, and not surprisingly in a related fashion, these were students who were doing either bachelor's or master's degrees, so not doing doctorate education, which are usually funded by universities, right? And then when we try to unpack the mechanisms, what we essentially see is that a lot of what can be explained is driven by increases in housing wealth or increases in income that were happening as a result of this export growth, right? There was less evidence to support other channels like changes to the returns to schooling or better information. We'll talk about that, about how we unpack that. So when we do these kind of counterfactuals, we see that, you know, the current trade wars that we're currently involved in would have this kind of would lead to this big reduction in the export of educational services to China. And that's just counting, this number of 8% is only just counting the money that we're getting in terms of revenue, in terms of tuition revenue, not counting kind of the broader impact on the local economies that surround these US universities, right? So international students have these big impacts on local economies as well. So I don't know, you know, if you've been to like East Lansing recently, you'll see like international students play a big role in propping up the rental market or buying cars. So we're not even counting that lost revenue from that. We're only counting the revenue loss more directly in terms of tuition revenue to the university. So these current trade wars can be quite bad for the university sector. Okay, so let's go into the details of the empirical strategy. So what we do is we get together a few cool new data sets, actually. So the first one is we followed the US government for information on all international students that came to the US. We followed them in 2013, which is why our data ends in 2013. It took many years for us to actually get the data from them, but we know, importantly, we know exactly which city these students are coming from, you know, where they're going, what they're studying. So this is some new interesting data that we then combine with data on production by city level. So we know essentially what products are being produced in different cities in China, which is going to be important for our identification strategy when we talk about the trade shock, right? So these are the kind of the two main data sets that we kind of combine, and we then get in some other data to unpack certain mechanisms. What this data allow us to do is then create a panel of about 274 cities that we can track over time, right? And so what is the kind of the identification strategy that we're using? Well, if you've seen, you know, if you follow the China shock literature, you'll know, you know, this is the same strategy that the Pearson-Schott paper used. But essentially what happened was when China joined the WTO in 2001, they were conferred what we call permanent normal trade relation tariffs, right? So once you join the WTO, you know that permanently your products will be will face a much lower tariff, right? Earlier, to have normal trade relation tariffs, you needed the US Congress to kind of approve it every year. And so there was all this uncertainty, which essentially Chinese manufacturers, because of the uncertainty, didn't invest a lot in these kind of exporting sectors. So joining the WTO essentially gets rid of that uncertainty and allows Chinese manufacturers to really invest in these sectors that now have lower tariffs, right? So at the industry level, you can then create what we call this NTR gap, right? So the gap between what the prevailing, the non-NTR tariffs were, and then the NTR tariffs, the normal trade relation tariffs that you are now applicable to you once you join the WTO, right? So that's an industry level shock, but we want to know how different cities are affected. So to do that, you weight these industry level shocks by essentially by the share of production in the different cities at baseline, right? So let me give you an example here. So for instance, let's look at, so these are different products. Each of this is a different product, but like, so look at the line over here. This is say footwear, right? It had so firstly, what you see is that all NTR tariffs were lower than the non-NTR tariffs. With footwear, the reduction in tariffs was small. It was, you know, modest, not that big. Whereas for something like soaps and detergents, there was a much bigger reduction in tariffs, right? So cities that at baseline were producing toiletries, soaps, detergents would have a much faster growth in production than cities that were, say, producing footwear, right? So that's the kind of the variation we're using. And so you can then create these weighted averages across different Chinese cities based on kind of the product share at baseline, right? So that's the variation we're using over here. We can do some kind of tests. For instance, we can look at in the pre-period before China joins the WTO, so before 2001, this IV, this instrumental variable that we've created, how is that correlated with a bunch of things? So how is that, well, most importantly for us, how is that correlated with the education sector? There's not that much correlation really that we can detect in with the education sector in terms of college students, number of colleges. It was also not really correlated at baseline, with not much correlation at baseline with the exports over that period. But after China joins the WTO, you see there's this, so this is in the decade after China joins the WTO, you see there's this strong correlation between this IV that we've created, this PNTR IV, and export growth, right? So this is kind of our first stage of what we're trying to identify here, right? And so we use this same shock, and I'm going to show you a few reduced form results. We use the same shock to look at what happens to the growth in international students. And what you see is that it led to an increase in student migration. And this shock really explains a meaningful fraction of the total increase in the flow of international students from China to the US, right? I say differential trade shock because, you know, this is kind of like a diff in diff. So even cities that faced small trade shocks contributed kind of to meaningful increases in student flows from the US, from China to the US, right? So we do a few different robustness checks. You know, the trade literature talks about different types of controls that we should talk about. I don't know if you recognize, but what our instrument is essentially kind of a shift share instrument. And there's a recent literature that encourages us to do a lot of different checks with these shift share instruments. We are kind of more in the Dow et al. Framework, where we have exogenous shifters rather than exogenous shares, which is what the Goldsmith income tests are more about. But we can do all these different checks. We can drop large cities or capitals. You know, if you drop it, if you notice there was some big city, there's like Beijing and Shanghai that are in this bin, I think. But if you drop them, you still get like a pretty strong relationship. I think it's a stronger relationship with other outliers. We also, I won't go into these in too much detail, but there are two other identification strategies that we actually use. One is the world import demand, which is essentially the China shock, the Otto Don Hansen China shock IV. Which has to do with, again, the baseline production share. So again, whether your city produces footwear or soap, interacted with the demand for footwear and soap products from all other countries, right? So does Germany want to buy a lot more footwear now? And so that's going to affect growth. So and then there's another IV, which Khandelwal and co-authors have talked a lot about, which is the expiration of the multi-fiber agreement that allowed the textile sector to grow rapidly. So again, these are these reduced form regressions, and you can see that all of these kind of have, the outcome here is, again, student growth, student outflows. You can see that all of these have these strong relationships with student flows to the US, right? So I want to spend some time to talk a little bit about the mechanisms. So one type of mechanism could really be that there was this kind of income growth or wealth growth, right? What the trade shock did was it made people richer, and so that eased these liquidity constraints that students may have had, so they can now afford to go to the US, pay that higher tuition. But also income growth could also just lead to a reallocation of consumption towards services, right? So the Engel curve could essentially be a certain way where as you're richer, you now consume a lot more services in your consumption basket, right? There could be other changes to, for instance, the returns to a US degree, for instance, or capacity constraints at local colleges as and when people become richer in your city. It could be, for instance, that now that you are trading with the US, you have more knowledge about US institutions. So these are the different types of mechanisms that we try to go into detail with. To summarize, what we kind of find is that we find that we find most evidence consistent with the income or wealth channel. We find that that's kind of the driving force. These other channels seem to play less of a role. So what do we mean by income or wealth growth? Well, a lot of it, interestingly, we find is driven by increases in real estate prices and real estate income. So you see that the trade shock was correlated with a big increase in real estate price growth. The share of rents, share of rental income in family income. There was also you also see more self-employed, more entrepreneurial income being strongly correlated with this kind of shock. But also in general, what you see is that this growth in wealth led to a reallocation of consumption towards services. So not just US, it's not just that these individuals are buying more in terms of US higher education, they're buying more in terms of other services as well, right? So income growth can do that. And you know, if income growth is really an important channel, you shouldn't just see an increase in flows of students from China just to the US. You should also see an increase in flows of students from China going to other countries like Australia, Canada, UK. You really see there's this big increase over this period to going to other countries as well. Of course, the US is on a totally different scale altogether, given the size of the higher education sector. But you see that there was this increase in flows to other countries as well, right? What about changes in returns to education? We don't find too much in terms of evidence supporting that. There's some other work that really shows that the trade shock was actually, it actually lowered the returns to education because it actually raised unskilled wages more than skilled wages. So it was kind of a more unskilled shock. These trade shocks were more kind of an unskilled shock. There's also some other work that shows that, you know, they did an audit study essentially where they send resumes showing that the US degree is actually less valuable than Chinese degrees in the Chinese labor market. So we don't think the returns to education could be a big factor here. We also don't think that you're hitting up against any capacity constraints at local universities. You don't see any kind of big crowding at the top Chinese universities, at least in any way that was related to the trade shock. What about information? What about knowledge about the US market more specifically? What we can do with our trade IV is we can actually unpack exports to the US versus exports to other countries. So for instance, if certain products are more likely to be sent to Brazil or Australia, then those cities that, so say footwear is more likely to be sent to Brazil or Australia, then those cities might have a better knowledge of Brazil and Australia as labor market or education market, but maybe not the US market as such. It turns out that you get the same result whether you use the US or the non-US trade shock, essentially, suggesting that it's not really about something US, knowing more about the US in particular. It might be more something to do with income growth as such, right? When we look at really migration elasticities, you see that the biggest impacts are really coming from, so we know in our FOIA data, we know that we know exactly how much money students are putting in themselves and how much money are coming from universities. You see that these trade shocks are really, the elasticity is much stronger for students that don't have any funding, as opposed to students that do get funding from these universities, right? So they're paying for these students are essentially paying for their education. Relatedly, you really see that the big increase is at the bachelor's and master's level, where students have to pay for their education, rather than at the doctorate level, where they often receive funding from universities, right? And then the last thing I want to, the last result really is related to how, where are students going? Which parts of the US are these students going to? And we think this is important because there's this literature on the China shock and how the China shock really can exacerbate geographical inequalities within the US, right? So the China shock had a really bad effect on the Rust Belt and the Midwest, but actually the coast did relatively better. So it kind of exacerbated this regional inequality. What we actually find instead is that students are really going to kind of, if you kind of divide the US by commuting zones related to what fraction of adults in those commuting zones are college graduates, you see that these students are really going all over the country, right? So they're going to the Midwest, they're going to schools in Michigan and Iowa, they're going to Purdue and Minnesota and UPenn and Penn State. So they're also going to the kind of, so it's kind of mitigating these regional inequalities that might have been exacerbated by the China shock, right? So how do we reconcile, like how big are these effects? What we can do is we can take the current increase in tariffs that happened because of the current trade wars, and we can do a counterfactual exercise, right? Now that we have these elasticities, we know how a change in tariffs affects a change in exports, and then how a change in exports affects the flow of students. We can do this counterfactual exercise where we go the other way around and we say, okay, now that the US government increased these tariffs for Chinese products, how will that affect student flows? And we can then multiply this change in student flows by the average tuition that we see in our data that these students are paying. And we can see that that really affects, just in terms of tuition revenue, it has a meaningful effect on the higher education sector, right? So it's going to affect, it's going to lead to a reduction in higher education exports, especially to China, essentially, right? And this, like I said before, this is not including the broader GE effects on the local economy. So it's not affecting, we're not talking about the effect on like the East Lansing economy, but just the revenue to Michigan State University, for instance, right? And this was just, you know, when we wrote the paper, we were just talking about trade wars, but since then, there's been a lot more that's happened over the last month. You know, the last week, actually, the US canceled about 1,000 visas for graduate students and research scholars from China because they claim because of these, they might have military ties. Yeah, schools have been aware of this even back in 2018. They knew that something like this was going to happen, so they kind of they started writing insurance contracts to kind of protect themselves from stuff like this, right? So what we really showed, what we wanted to convey here was that when we had these export-driven growth in China, what we find is that students are less likely to stay and participate in the local education market. Instead, they're more likely to migrate to the US. And most of this migration was really among self-funded students at the undergraduate level across really all over the US, including the Midwest. And the reason we think this is important is that, you know, there's this big focus on the China shock and how there's a goods deficit with China. And what that entire discussion has missed is that there's this cycling back of that, some of that revenue stream that has actually aided the US higher education sector, right? So the rise of the kind of the export in higher education services has been really important for the higher education sector. So concurrently, any such trade tension would hurt these US universities, especially public universities, because like we showed earlier, you know, this revenue from international students has been really important for universities to keep these tuition levels low and to kind of maintain this quality of these universities without having to cut expenditures, right? And one of my other colleagues, Kevin, really shows this other great paper on how international students have been great at really cross-subsidizing education for local students, right? So the revenue that we get from international students essentially helps cross-subsidize local domestic students in the US, right? So I'm gonna stop here. I don't know how long that was, but since Justin didn't interrupt me, I think I may be okay.
Beautiful. Thank you, Gaurav. That was fascinating and kept to time. I really, I think the Association of US universities should hire you for their PR and lobbying front. Messages that might play well here in DC about the increase, not just in students overall, but in unfunded students who are paying out of pocket to come. And the positive, you know, the progressive distributional aspects of where these students end up. That's, those are super interesting details. Okay, before we throw it open to broader questions, let's turn over to Bilge, who has slides as well. Do you want to try sharing your screen?
Sure.
Excellent. I can see your slides if you go to full screen mode.
Yep.
All right, over to you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much for having me discuss this paper, both to Justin and to Gaurav. And it's, I think, really important and well-written paper on a very important topic. And it was a great pleasure for me to read it. And I really enjoyed both the structure of the paper as well as the policy implications that it puts forward. quite important. So let me start with a brief summary. So the paper examines the effect of China's WTO accession on students' enrollment in US universities. So to do that, it uses this variation in PNTR exposure across prefectures of China. And it finds that the Chinese prefectures that were more exposed to the reduction in tariff uncertainty ended up sending more students to the US. And the effects are larger, particularly for students who finance their studies through their personal funds, who studied non-STEM fields, and those who attended less selective US universities. For potential channels, the paper documents that these prefectures experienced higher growth in housing income and wealth, and tries to probe into some additional channels that I'm going to discuss. I think this is a very important paper. It's very clearly written. I really enjoyed reading it. It has many interesting results on a very important and highly policy relevant topic. I think it's an important contribution to now an increasing set of papers that try to focus on this China shock, looking at, in many cases, many papers use this policy uncertainty shock coming from the PNTR. And the nice thing, as Gaurav said, is that it has a unique data set that I didn't see it was used before, coming from this Freedom of Information Act. It essentially knows the origin of every Chinese student and when they started, what they studied, quite detailed data set. And the strategy follows Pearson Schott, focusing on this, as I said, the PNTR shock. So it's nice that it's exploiting this exogenous variation in that. And contributes to this policy debate, really important, on the cost of the trade war, estimating that the potential costs are over $1 billion US in tuition revenue. So when the US tries to, protect itself from Chinese competition, it actually ends up hurting itself through the services trade. So more substantively, if I was, let's say, referee what some of the issues in the paper, if I want to highlight a few, is that, and they're not, these are just take it as suggestive, they're not sort of like major issues, but I think one issue is that, the data starts in 2004. So what that means is that there's actually no data prior to the implementation of the PNTR. So even though the way the paper is written seems to be, it's a diff design, right? But for a diff design, we need to be able to difference out the effect in the earlier period, the potential effect. But the paper is actually, because the data starts from 2004, it's a long difference design without comparing the outcome variable before and after the reform. So the issue here is essentially that the prefectures that were sort of more affected post the reform period could already have been sending more students to the US even before the reform. And we cannot rule out the hypothesis that this potential hypothesis without having the pre-data. So if the reform really did increase the number of the students, then again, it's important to difference out the pre-reform period to obtain what is the actual impact of the trade reform. In terms of pre-trend tests, we see some evidence there's no effect on domestic college enrollments and exports. I think that's really useful. For the domestic college enrollments, there's no effect on the pre-period, but there's also no effect in the post-period. So it's, I think, suggestive, but it's not sort of conclusive on that. In terms of specification, there's so many other reforms, of course, that happened during the same time period, and the paper controls for a number of them, including contract intensity, output tariffs, input tariffs, and export license. It could also control for additional policy changes that were shown to significantly affect domestic outcomes. including sort of exposure to the MFA. I know you do sort of a study looking at just the effect of the MFA, having similar effect itself, but I think it can be thought as a control as well, and using the same sort of quotas. And the other policy they can control for is changes in the NTR tariff rate itself, which changed very slightly, but it's also many papers control for that too. So I see that the scatter plots are weighted by prefecture population, and the regressions do not seem to be weighted. So maybe I missed that, but it could be useful to weight them. And the standard errors don't seem to be clustered at the prefecture level. I didn't see that. Maybe you did it already, but I didn't see it in the paper written out. For the construction of the weight, for the 1990 weights, you're using the firm data, firm survey data, but that's focusing on large establishments and is going to miss employment in sort of small firms. And so it can be better to use the 1990 census to obtain a more representative weighting of the initial industry composition. So in terms of channels, so the paper finds an increase in GDP at the prefecture level, but not GDP per capita. And that's because population is also increasing. And so the evidence presented in the housing wealth in scatter plots, I think is useful, but it appears somewhat more suggestive. So if average income is not rising, so what is the code? Is it the case that individuals accumulate more wealth? And there's sort of a discussion of this in the paper, but I think it could be useful to show more evidence of this. It could also be that inequality is rising very fast and sort of this wealth is accumulating by the very rich. And that very rich people's kids essentially end up going to these US universities, but it seems very hard to document this channel given the data limitations. I think if it could be shown, this would really, I think, pin down the main mechanism you have in mind. In terms of returns and information, this is my last slide. So you show that sort of how enrollments to US universities vary by skill intensity of the NTR, showing mostly unskilled NTR gap, right, explains the results. But I think it can be also important to look at how wages change in response to the shock, which can be done using firm surveys. And the minor comments, looking at the previous literature, you cite the Lee paper and you say that she finds export expansion reduces education attainment within China. But actually, if you look at her paper, she finds that high skill export shocks actually raise both high school and college enrollments, and low skill export shocks actually depress both. So it's a much more nuanced story that she finds in that paper. In terms of information mechanism, you show that the shock, the PNTR shock, increases exports to non-US destinations as well. This appeared to me somewhat inconsistent with the previous evidence in the literature that has been shown that actually US locations exports did not increase all that much, including the EU and Japan. We also included Korea and Taiwan to that list, and we found that mostly the exports to the US rose from these destinations, and the other places were not did not receive significant exports. So I think reconciling with the previous literature can help with that. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Bilge. I'm gonna give Gaurav just a minute not to respond to all of that, but you can take you have the presenter's prerogative of selectively responding, because I'm not going to give you enough time to respond to everything. In the meantime, other people who have questions, if they want to start either pinging me in the chat that you want to be in line, or if you know how to use the Zoom functions to raise your hand, start preparing your questions, because we'll open it up here in just a minute. Gaurav, you want to respond to all of that?
No, so Bilge, thanks a lot. Those are amazing comments. They're really, they're super helpful. Yeah, I mean, so controlling for the MFA, so we didn't want to control for the MFA because we think of that as a source of exogenous variation for us. And so we wanted to, I mean, we've considered combining the, having two instruments of a more of an over-identified model. But yeah, we can come back to talking about that. Clustering, also regression is at the prefecture level. So, but the important thing that I really wanted to, which is about the channel. So we do think that what's happening is an increase in income at the top of the income distribution, really. We did some other tests. I don't know if, let me see if I can reshare my screen, but here, so if you look at kind of the, I don't know if you can you guys see my screen again? So, but if you can look at like the fraction of, this is just kind of a macro exercise that we did, which is like the fraction of college age students that are studying in the US and the fraction of households that have incomes that can afford a US tuition. At the macro level, they really map out pretty well, but this is not just because average incomes in China are going up, but also because there's like a big lump in the income distribution that kind of shifted at the upper middle income level that really shifted, right, over this period. So we do think that I think that was an interesting thing that we should talk a little bit more about, where in the income distribution we think this effect is happening. But the other comments are also really great, and thanks a lot.
Okay, let's give a chance for other people to jump in here. Michael, did anyone want to come in? Michael?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Great. One virtual platform was hijacking my microphone and I wasn't able to speak before. I apologize, but I was actually attending the whole thing. It's fascinating work. Thanks a lot. There's a lot to talk about, but maybe just one issue I could raise is in that paper you referenced with Maria Pia Mendola, a lot of our interest is on the relationship between the income elasticity of migration and selection in migration. And the simplest model of this is a capital constraint. If you have enough money to pay tuition, you go. If you don't, you don't, would imply that this shock would lead to less and less positive selection among migrants. That is relatively negative selection, in the crudest terms, less and less productive students, or maybe more precisely speaking, children of households that have traits that are less and less economically productive and may have inherited those traits, would be the ones who are coming. I wonder if there's any way in data from the US side, maybe even ACS data, I don't know, to corroborate that particular implication of the model, because just more generally, I think that there could be that the relationship between selection and income elasticity that we highlight in that paper could be could be the source of fruitful tests to address some of Birge's very interesting points.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. So we do think that there is, I mean, we are probably moving down the kind of the selection curve in some ways where there's more negative selection, but we think of that negative selection more to be on the income side. So, these households couldn't afford it. The marginal household now is poorer than the average household that had sent students abroad. But we don't know if that income, if how rich your parents are is correlated with how smart the students are. So it could be that, the poorer students are actually, well, they care more about studying, they care more about learning. What we have done in the other paper that I cited is look at the US side, just as you suggested. If you look at the test scores for incoming students, what you see is the international students, their SAT scores are a lot higher than out-of-state domestic students, and then it's in-state domestic students. So there's this kind of ranking in terms of the SAT scores, and that's consistently that trend is kind of been flat over time. So it's not like as and when there have been there's a bigger increase in international students, it's not that the marginal test scores as such have fallen off a lot, right? So it's been kind of flat when you look at the test score. So I think that's kind of a bit of the test that you were suggesting in some ways, right?
Thanks a lot.
I don't know if there is one outstanding question I see on the chat window. Thomas, did you want to repeat your question here?
Sure, thanks, Justin. So Gaurav, fantastic paper, super interesting. My question was on just the US regional inequalities. So it's kind of showing that they're kind of dispersed regionally across the US. I was wondering if there's more you could do around kind of where the marginal dollar is spent on kind of higher education, and whether that goes, how much of that goes towards some of the people who may specifically be kind of crowded out by some of the trade laws, and not just kind of geographically distributed, but still kind of concentrated among PhDs. I just don't know kind of what the, both what those trade costs are, but also what the kind of benefits of the marginal dollar spent. So just wondering if you could, if you had anything to kind of expand on there.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a great question. And, so we're working on a kind of a follow-up paper looking at the US side. So the same team, but with Brian Knight, who's a professor at Brown, we're looking at really like what happens to these US local economies, essentially leveraging the China shock as a push factor to then see what happens to these local economies, not just in terms of, like what happens in terms of like what happens to not just real estate prices in the US, but also just what's happening to different types of industries. What are these international students kind of spending on, and then what happens to then local wages as such. So, and once we kind of have a better sense of what's going on there, it'll help us account for some of the things that you're talking about, like, get a better sense of doing the math on kind of the things that you're mentioning. But I think that's a great, next research question for us, what we're most excited about.
Awesome, that's really exciting. Okay,
Floor is open. Anybody else? Otherwise, I have a super geeky econometrics question I'm going to ask Gaurav. If nobody wants to ask something more
substantive. Dave, I'd be interested in hearing about your experience with the FOIA process. Yeah, so it's been, I've put in many different FOIAs with the US government. This one, so Kevin and I had separately put in FOIAs for the international student data. For me, I think it took me about 2.5 years at that time to get the data. Things have slowed down drastically over the last couple of years. We've gotten a lot of H-1B data, again, for the FOIA process, where we know, again, every single H-1B worker. But that has essentially, they've stopped responding almost to our FOIAs. We're trying to do things, get J1 data, which is US international physicians coming to the US, especially at a time like the pandemic. It's really important for us to know where these physicians are and what important role they're playing and something like this. We asked for this physician data, I think about 2016, that's right. There's no sign of it. So the FOIA process, sometimes you're lucky and sometimes you're not that lucky, but you have to write these letters, and then they'll come back and say something about how this is confidential. So one field you ask for is confidential, so they reject it all outright, and then you say that, okay, give me the other, it's just back and forth at this stage.
Cool.
Thank you.
So
it's better than, in some ways better than, so I do the same thing with Indian data, where it's kind of different because you need a different set of skills. There's a FOIA process, but there you need to go to the office, buy everyone a cup of tea, talk to them about cricket, talk to them about their like kids and politics, and then they'll be like, okay, here's a pen drive. I just like copy all the data for you. You know, it's a different set of skills you need. But
sounds like Turkey.
Sorry?
Sorry, I was saying sounds like Turkey.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
So I'm going to insert myself here, Gaurav. You mentioned in your kind of Bartik IV setup that, you know, we've got these two camps or approaches opening up between sort of the Goldsmith-Pinkham et al. Exogenous shares, and I was thinking more of the Borusiak et al. Paper, but you mentioned the Adao et al. Paper with the exogenous shifts, if I heard you right. Can you say a little bit, I don't know if you can articulate in a sentence then, what your identifying assumption is about that shift? This is mostly for my own econometrics edification.
No, I think it's actually kind of a fascinating literature. So let me see if I can, share my screen again. So let's go back to kind of the instrument, right? So the instrument is the interaction between two things. This is what we call the share in the shift share, right? So this is the share, and then this is the shifter, right? So the Goldsmith-Pinkham kind of setup has come up with tests for checking whether your shares are quote unquote exogenous, whereas the Borusiak et al. And the Adao et al. Are saying, look, it's fine if your shares are endogenous. We want to know that these shocks or these shifters are kind of exogenous. So they come up with different types of tests. You know, you actually don't really know which world you are in. You make a claim that you're saying, you know, we think we are in the exogenous shifters world because we think that NTR gap is more exogenous, but you could still do all the Goldsmith-Pinkham tests even in that world and see kind of what. For instance, the Adao et al. The main thing that the Adao et al. Paper is trying to say is that, look, these shifters are going to be correlated, right? So it's not that there's only one city producing footwear and there's one city producing soap, right? There's a bunch of cities that produce footwear and a bunch of cities that produce soap. And it's not that you can cluster at some regional level, because it could be that cities at two different ends of the country produce footwear, right? But you can correct for the standard errors, saying that, you know, your variation is coming. If your variation is coming at the shifter level, you should essentially be, quote unquote, I'm not going to say the word cluster, but quote unquote, correcting your standard errors at the shifter level, right? So if, for instance, there were like 90% of your cities were producing footwear, then, you know, you don't have so many independent observations, really, right? So it's correcting the standard errors for that, right? So the more variation you have in the distribution of which cities are producing what products, the better in terms of kind of the standard errors. Of course, all the papers still have a set of common tests, things like checking for pre-trends, and there's like a few other tests that you'll see are actually kind of, that make sense. Like anyone who did like simple diff and diff would also know, yeah, let's just check for pre-trends in some of these things. But then some of the other tests kind of depend on whether you're more in the exogenous share world or the exogenous shifter world. But yeah, I think it's a fascinating kind of new part of the literature, right? That's kind of been pretty helpful.
That was surprisingly intuitively clear, and I got my money's worth just for that econometrics lesson. Thank you for that. I'm okay, and seems like I inadvertently asked Michael's question. So we picked Michael's second question. We ticked that last one off the box there as well. We're just about at time here. If anybody wants to make a plea in the chat window, just stick around for a minute with more scintillating econometrics questions for Bilge or Gaurav. you can do that. But otherwise, we're trying to pioneer this, bite-size seminar afternoons here. We're sticking to 1 hour. We appreciate you both for packing so much in to a short amount of time here. That was super fascinating. I hope the media debate around international students picks up these messages as well. Appreciate you, especially Bilge, being with us and bringing your expertise on this topic to bear. Thanks, everybody. And we'll see you again in a month or so time for the next seminar. We'll let you know.
Thanks. Yeah, and thank you, Bilge, really, for reading that.
Oh, thank you so much.
And really great comments. They're extremely helpful, really. Yeah, for instance, the thing about the pre-trends, yeah, so we're trying to get the international student data now going back to 2000. It's still only like really one kind of pre-period, but we just know we can't get data before that. They didn't record it electronically. It's essentially on the CVIS system that didn't, so they don't have it before that. But I think hopefully if we get the data back to at least the year 2000, we can kind of get at the, but that is one of the main, you really picked on the kind of the main thing that we don't have at this time. So we're doing these long differences, say, between 2004 and 2013, but ideally you want to do the difference between 2000 and 2013, right? Or even like 1999 and 2013, right? before the shock. So you're right, that's kind of the main thing that we really need to figure out. So.
Yeah, I think the paper is very convincing. I mean, I totally bought the story. So I just said those comments just to sort of strengthen the paper so you can pass the referee too in the revision.
Thanks. Yeah, thank you, really. Yeah.
All right, guys. Unless any of the shy people who are hanging in back jump in here, I think we might call it there. Thanks again, and have a good afternoon. Hopefully do this in person next time, as you said, Gaurav.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, we can go to Soy 38 and do the whole thing all over again. Yeah.
There you go.
Thank you, Bilge, and thank you for the questions.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks, Gaurav.